Deep in space, aboard the warship Eclipse, Captain Alara Voss stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. The distress signal had been repeating for hours, a message filled with static, broken words, and something even more terrifying, her own voice. If you don't stop them now, the universe will burn. It made no sense. She had never recorded this message, never sent out a distress call from deep space. And yet, there it was, a warning from a version of herself that shouldn't exist. The crew was silent, staring at her, waiting for answers she didn't have. The signal came from an uncharted system, a place where no human ship had ever gone before. The war between Earth and the unknown enemy had just begun, but this message suggested something worse, a war that hadn't even happened yet. Alara had no choice. She ordered the Eclipse forward, diving into the unknown, towards a future she didn't understand. As the ship moved closer, the static in the transmission grew louder, like a storm raging through space. Then, another voice came through, just a whisper beneath the noise, but enough to make her blood run cold. They know you are coming. The Eclipse dropped out of hyperspace, and the scene before them was devastating. A planet, or what was left of one, drifted in shattered pieces. Fire still burned in the wreckage of cities, massive craters showing where something had torn through the surface with unimaginable force. But the most chilling part wasn't the destruction. It was the shipwreck floating in the debris, an Earth warship, identical to the Eclipse, with her name on it. The damaged hull read Eclipse 2, as if this was another version of her ship, destroyed long before she had ever arrived. The crew was frozen in shock. How was this possible? There was no record of another eclipse, no knowledge of a second mission. Alara's mind raced. Was this what the message had warned her about? Was this her future? Before she could think further, the sensors blared. They were not alone. From the shadows of space, ships emerged, sleek, dark, moving without sound, like hunters stalking their prey. The enemy had been waiting. A warning shot streaked past the Eclipse, and suddenly the comms crackled to life. A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke. You should not have come. The words sent a shiver down Alara's spine. It was not a threat. It was a statement, cold and absolute. She had stepped into something far bigger than she understood. The enemy wasn't just reacting to her presence, they had expected it. Alara didn't wait. Shields up. Prepare to fire. The Eclipse's cannons powered up, targeting the unknown ships, but before they could attack, something impossible happened. The enemy ships flickered, as if they weren't entirely real. For a brief second, they became transparent, like ghosts in space. And then they were behind them. It wasn't speed. It wasn't stealth. They had moved in a way that shouldn't be possible. A sudden explosion rocked the ship, alarms screaming as enemy fire ripped through the lower decks. Alara gritted her teeth. Evasive maneuvers. Return fire. The ship twisted, weapons blazing, but something felt wrong. No matter how many shots they fired, the enemy was always one step ahead, as if they already knew every move before it happened. Then the whisper returned. Her own voice. You can't win this fight, not like this. Alara froze. This wasn't just a recording. It was speaking to her now. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The message wasn't from the past. It wasn't even from the future. It was happening in real time. But how? Was this some kind of time distortion? Or something worse? The voice was weak, filled with static but desperate. Listen to me, Alara. They are not what you think. They do not exist in time the way we do. You have to leave, or they will erase you. Erase. The words sent ice through her veins. What if these enemies weren't just here to destroy humanity? What if they had the power to remove them from existence completely? The wreckage of the second eclipse was that what had happened to it? Had another version of her fought this battle and lost? And if so, how many times had this happened before? The crew was still fighting, still believing they could win, but Alara saw the truth now. This wasn't a battle. It was a trap, a cycle repeating again and again until they finally understood. until they broke free. She made the decision in an instant. Cease fire. All power to the engines. Get us out of here now. The crew hesitated, confused, but she didn't have time to explain. That's an order. The Eclipse turned sharply, engines roaring as it sped away from the battlefield. The enemy ships didn't chase them. They didn't have to. One by one, they started to disappear, vanishing into the void as if they had never been there. The moment they left the ruined planet behind, the distress signal cut off. The static was gone. Silence filled the ship. Alara sat back, breathing hard, her mind spinning. What had just happened? What were those things? And most importantly, why had they let her go? She looked at the crew, at their shaken expressions, and realized they had only scratched the surface of something terrifying. The wreckage, the message, the repeating cycle, this was only the beginning. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, they were still watching. Waiting. Because next time, they wouldn't let her escape. And the next time might already be happening. Alara Voss stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, her eyes locked on the massive wreck floating before them. It was an Earth warship, just like theirs, but twisted and broken, its hull scorched by weapons far beyond human technology. The name Eclipse 2 was barely visible through the burn marks, and for a moment, Alara felt like she was staring at a ghost. This ship should not exist. There was no record of another Eclipse, no mission that had come here before. And yet, here it was, destroyed, drifting lifelessly in space. The crew whispered among themselves, their voices filled with unease. The distress signal they had followed had led them here, but now an even bigger mystery stood before them. Who had sent the message? And how could a ship identical to theirs be floating in ruins when they had never been here before? Before she could process it, the sensors blared with an urgent alert. Something was moving within the wreckage. Weapons locked on, targeting the unknown, but the screens showed nothing but empty space. There's nothing there, her tactical officer murmured, his voice uncertain. But Alara knew better. Something was watching them. The air in the bridge grew heavy, like an unseen force pressing against them. Then, without warning, the darkness of space seemed to shift, and suddenly they were not alone. Sleek black ships materialized from the void, their surfaces smooth and unnatural, as if they were not built but grown. They had no visible weapons, no heat signatures, and yet every instinct in Alara's body screamed danger. They didn't move like normal ships. They glided through space in unnatural patterns, appearing and disappearing like shadows flickering in the dark. Are they cloaked? One of her officers whispered, but Alara shook her head. This wasn't cloaking. This was something else. Something that defied logic. The enemy ships surrounded them, forming a silent blockade. Yet, they didn't fire. They didn't send any communication. They just watched. Then, the comms crackled to life, and a voice spoke. You are not meant to be here. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even angry. It was a fact. Cold. Absolute. Alara felt a chill run through her spine. Who were they? What did they mean? Before she could respond, a soft beeping filled the bridge. The crew turned to the monitors in horror. The Eclipse's records were changing. The ship's logs, its mission history, even their own memories stored in the system, it was rewriting itself. The records now showed that they had never existed. Their mission was gone, their past erased line by line. This isn't possible, the data officer stammered. It's like we were never born. A sudden impact rocked the ship. Red lights flashed as the hull groaned under pressure, yet the enemy had not fired a single shot. Another shockwave, and then another, each one heavier than the last. The crew screamed as gravity itself seemed to bend, pulling them in directions that didn't make sense. Alara grabbed the controls, struggling to keep the ship stable. They're not attacking us, she realized out loud. They're erasing us. Panic spread across the bridge. If these enemies could rewrite reality, how could they fight back? How could they survive? Desperation took over as Alara made a split-second decision. Fire all weapons. The Eclipse's cannons roared, energy blasts streaking towards the enemy ships. For a moment, they seemed to hit nothing, passing straight through the enemy like shooting at ghosts. But then, something changed. One of the enemy ships glitched, flickering in and out of existence before shattering like a broken illusion. The rest of the enemy ships reacted instantly, shifting, reforming. One moment, they were dozens. The next, they were thousands. A dark swarm, endless and terrifying. And then, without warning, they stopped. The voice returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the comms. It was inside Ellora's own head. "You were not meant to see this," it said, the words echoing like a whisper from the void. "You do not belong." Her vision blurred. The bridge around her faded, her crew's voices distant and hollow. For a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure she was still real. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the enemy ships were gone. The Eclipse floated in the same empty void, the wreckage of the Eclipse II still drifting nearby. Had it been real? Or had she imagined it? The crew sat in stunned silence. The records were back, the system restored. The ship's logs showed that they had always been here. But something felt wrong. Elora's hands trembled as she stared at the wreckage outside. The distress signal had stopped. The threat had vanished. But one question remained, the one that sent fear crawling down her spine. If these enemies could erase people from history, had they already erased someone else? The warship Eclipse drifted through deep space, its engines humming softly as it patrolled the outer sectors. Captain Alara Voss stood on the bridge, her eyes scanning the reports on her screen. Something was wrong. Their last mission, a simple reconnaissance, had ended with an ambush. The enemy had known exactly where they would be. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had given them that information. Someone on this ship was a traitor. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her crew was loyal, handpicked for this mission, each one trained to fight for humanity's survival. But one of them had betrayed that trust. And until she found out who, they were all in danger. The tension in the air was suffocating. The officers spoke in hushed voices, their movements careful, as if they too sensed something was wrong. The Eclipse was heading back to base, but Alara knew she couldn't wait that long. If the traitor was still on board, they might strike again. She had to act before it was too late. She called a meeting in the war room, summoning her top officers. They sat around a long table, faces grim, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath. "Someone on this ship is feeding information to the enemy," she said, her voice steady. "That person is still among us." A heavy silence followed. The crew exchanged wary glances, suspicion creeping into their eyes. Lieutenant Dane Carter, her second in command, leaned forward. "Captain, do we have any leads? Any evidence?" She hesitated. She had no solid proof, only the certainty that the leak had come from inside. "Not yet," she admitted, "but I will find out." Her gaze swept over the faces at the table. She had served with these people, trusted them with her life. Now she had to question everything. Hours passed, and the investigation began. Security logs were checked. Communications were traced. The ship's systems were scanned for any unauthorized transmissions. Nothing. It was as if the traitor had covered their tracks perfectly. But Alara knew the truth was buried somewhere. She just had to dig deep enough. Then, something strange happened. The lights flickered. A small disturbance, barely noticeable, but enough to make her heart race. The ship's systems were flawless. Power failures didn't just happen. She turned to her engineer, Lieutenant Mira Solis, who was already typing furiously on her console. "It's not a system failure," Mira said, her voice tense. "Someone is accessing the power grid manually." Alara didn't hesitate. "Lock down the ship. No one moves without my order." Security teams spread out. Then, a scream echoed through the halls. Alara ran, her pulse pounding. The sound had come from the lower decks, near the engine room. When she arrived, the sight made her blood run cold. Lieutenant Harris, one of her best officers, was dead. A single wound to his neck, clean and precise. No struggle. No noise. It was an execution. Her fists clenched. The traitor had killed again. The crew gathered, fear in their eyes. Alara scanned their faces, looking for any sign of guilt. Who among them had done this? She turned to Mira. Check the security footage. Now. Minutes later, the screen flickered, showing grainy footage of the hallway outside the engine room. A shadow moved swiftly, barely visible, but then a face appeared for a split second. Alora's breath caught. It was Dane Carter. The room fell silent as everyone turned to him. He didn't move, didn't deny it. Instead, he slowly stood, his expression calm. "I did what I had to," he said, his voice eerily steady. "You don't understand, Captain." "You never did." Alora's hands curled into fists. "You sold us out," she said coldly. "You betrayed your own people." Dane tilted his head slightly. "No. I saved them." The words sent a chill through the room. His eyes held no regret, no fear. Humanity is fighting. Alara felt rage burning inside her. "You think they'll spare you?" She spat. "You think they care about you?" Dane smiled, a slow, knowing grin. "They don't need to. They just need us to surrender." His hand moved toward his belt, reaching for something, a detonator. Alara didn't think. She acted. In one swift motion, she drew her weapon and fired. The shot hit Dane square in the chest. He staggered, his expression frozen in shock, then collapsed to the floor. The detonator rolled from his hand, harmless now. Silence filled the room. The traitor was dead. But the damage was done. The enemy had been inside their ship, inside their minds, and they had almost won. Alara exhaled slowly, looking at her crew. They were shaken, but alive. The eclipse had survived. But she knew this wasn't the end. The real enemy was still out there, waiting in the darkness, ready to strike again. And next time, there might be more than just one traitor among them. The war had lasted for years. Planets had been burned, fleets destroyed, and billions lost. The eclipse, humanity's last surviving warship, floated in the silent void, battered and exhausted. Captain Alara Voss stood on the bridge, staring at the enormous structure before them, a colossal alien machine, ancient and pulsing with a strange blue light. It was called the Void Engine, a remnant of a long-dead civilization, something beyond human understanding. But it was said to hold the power to end wars, erase enemies, rewrite existence itself. Alara had spent years fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. The Exalari, a species of biomechanical conquerors, had destroyed Earth, leaving only a handful of survivors. Now, the eclipse carried what remained of humanity, drifting in search of a miracle. And here it was, waiting in the dark, humming with an unnatural energy. But there was a catch, a choice that should not be made. The AI system, Sable, spoke softly, its voice calm but cold. "Captain, if you activate the Void Engine, it will wipe the Exalari from existence. They will have never existed." "But—" The hesitation in its voice made Alara's stomach tighten. "But what?" she demanded. Sable's screen flickered. "The energy required to erase a species must come from somewhere. A balance must be maintained. To erase the Exalari, something else must also be erased." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Define something else," Alara said carefully. Sable's calculations ran for a few seconds before the answer appeared. "Half of what remains of humanity." The words struck like a thunderclap. Alara's vision blurred as she tried to process the impossible decision before her. Save humanity by erasing half of its survivors? Or do nothing and let the Exalari finish what they started? She felt the weight of every lost battle, every desperate cry for help, every innocent life burned away by war. The faces of her crew stared at her, waiting. Lieutenant Dane Carter stepped forward. "Captain, if we don't do this, they will find us. And they will kill all of us." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "Half of us, for all of humanity. It's cruel, but it's logical." Commander Mirasolis shook her head. "That's not a choice," she said, her voice sharp. That's murder. We are not gods. We don't decide who lives and who dies. She turned to Alara, her eyes fierce. We fight. That's what we do. We don't take shortcuts. The void engine pulsed again, almost as if it could hear them, waiting for her answer. Alora's heart pounded. She was the captain. The decision was hers alone. If she activated the machine, the war would be over. Humanity would survive. But half of them randomly chosen would vanish. If she refused, the Acceleree would find them soon enough. And then there would be no one left. A sudden alarm cut through the silence. Acceleree ships were approaching. Hundreds of them, blocking every escape route. They had been waiting. They knew the humans were desperate, that they had found something powerful. And now they had come to stop them. Captain, we don't have time, Dane urged. It's now or never. Alara clenched her fists. The void engine thrummed, sensing her hesitation. A choice had to be made. A choice that should not be made. She closed her eyes. The Exalari were monsters, yes, but what kind of monster would she become if she sacrificed her own people? Could she live with that? Could humanity? The ship trembled as enemy fire struck the shields. Sable's voice was urgent now. Captain, decision required. Alara's hand hovered over the activation panel. Sweat dripped down her forehead. The ship shook again, harder this time. Another hit and the shields would fail. More lives lost. More names added to the endless list of the dead. Her eyes opened, and she made her choice. Her fingers moved, but not toward the activation panel. Instead, she shut down the console. The void engine powered down, its glow fading. We fight, she said. We don't play God. Dane's face twisted in disbelief. Captain, we just threw away our only chance. No, she said, stepping forward. We are still here. And as long as we are here, we fight. The Exalari ships closed in, weapons locking onto the Eclipse. Alara took a deep breath and gave the order. Fire everything. The Eclipse roared to life, unleashing every bit of its remaining power. Missiles streaked into the void. Cannons blazed. The Exalari fired back, and the ship shook violently, but the crew held firm. They fought with everything they had. And then something happened. The void engine, even in its dormant state, reacted to their defiance. A massive wave of energy pulsed outward, sweeping through space like a silent storm. The Exalari ships froze. Their bodies cracked, their forms breaking apart into light and dissolving. One by one, they vanished, not erased, but undone. Alara watched in stunned silence. The warship still stood. Her crew was still alive, and the enemy was gone. Not wiped from history, but defeated. The void engine had chosen a different way. Not destruction, but liberation. The bridge remained silent for a long moment. Then, Mira let out a breath. You did it, Captain. Alara exhaled slowly. No, she said. We did. The war was over. And humanity had survived without losing its soul. The battle was over. The enemy had fallen. The last Exalari warship burned in the void, its monstrous form breaking apart, swallowed by the endless darkness of space. The Eclipse, battered and barely holding together, drifted among the wreckage. Inside, the crew stood in stunned silence. They had won. Humanity had survived. But as the fires died down and the adrenaline faded, a single question hung in the air: at what cost? Captain Alara Voss leaned against the command console, her uniform torn, blood trickling from a cut above her brow. She had given everything to this war, her strength, her friends, her soul. And now, staring at the ruined battlefield, she felt no joy, no relief, only emptiness. The war was supposed to end in triumph, but victory had never felt so hollow. The bridge was eerily quiet. Lieutenant Dane Carter, her second in command, sat slumped in his chair, his breathing heavy. Commander Mira Solis checked the casualty reports, her fingers trembling over the screen. The list was too long. Too many names. Too many good people gone. Captain, Sable, the ship's AI spoke, its voice calm but heavy. We have sustained critical damage. Life support is failing on 3 decks. Power reserves are at 9%. We cannot sustain long-term survival. Alora closed her eyes. She had always known this mission would be a suicide run. The Eclipse was the last warship left. There had been no reinforcements, no backup plan. Just them, a desperate last stand against an enemy that had nearly wiped humanity from existence. And now that the fight was over, they were stranded, alone in the cold depths of space, surrounded by the wreckage of the war. Dane looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. We did it, Captain. The Exilari are gone. Alora forced a nod, but inside, she wondered if it had been worth it. The price of victory was always high, but this felt like too much. They had saved humanity, but at what cost? Earth was gone. The colonies were destroyed. The survivors, if there were any, were scattered across the galaxy, hiding, starving, waiting for a miracle that might never come. Is there any signal from the outer colonies? She asked. Sable paused before responding. No known human signals detected within our range. A cold chill ran down her spine. Were they truly the last ones left? Mira suddenly gasped, eyes wide as she read the latest report. Alara, the radiation levels. Alara's stomach dropped. She moved to the console, scanning the data. The entire battlefield was flooded with radiation. The Exilari ships had released something before their destruction, a final act of defiance. It was seeping into their systems, poisoning the ship, poisoning them. Dane exhaled shakily. So that's it then. Alora's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But the numbers didn't lie. The radiation was too strong. Even if they managed to repair the ship, they wouldn't live long enough to reach safety. The victory was theirs, but it was a victory that no one would live to celebrate. The crew exchanged glances, silent understanding passing between them. They had fought so hard, survived so much only to face a slow, inescapable death. Mira swallowed hard. We can send out a distress beacon, she said. Maybe someone somewhere will hear us. Alara nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Still, she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Even if all hope seemed lost, even if the universe had turned its back on them, she would fight until her last breath. Sable, she said, her voice steady, send the beacon. Broadcast our victory. Let the galaxy know that humanity stood until the very end. The AI obeyed, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the transmission being sent into the void. Dane let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You know, I always thought victory would feel different. Alara looked at him, at the exhausted, wounded faces around her. Victory was never about survival, she said softly. It was about proving that we would never surrender. That even at our weakest, we would stand. That even if we were outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched, we would fight. Silence fell again. The ship's lights flickered. The radiation crept through the corridors, slow and merciless. One by one, the crew members sat down, side by side, some leaning against the walls, others holding each other's hands. There was no panic, no fear, just quiet acceptance. They had done what no one else could. They had saved humanity. Even if no one would remember their names, they had won. Asa, the last of the power drained from the Eclipse. Alara took one final breath and whispered, "We were here."